This is an audio review of Chapter 10, Education and LGBTQ Youth, for Intro to LGBTQ Studies. So when looking at education and LGBTQ youth development, education is a very important social institution, especially due to the fact that youth spend the majority of their time in school or associated activities with school. So how a school is organized, who works in that school, and how well they're trained really, has an impact on youth. So some challenges to LGBTQ youth equity that exists in schools is underrepresentation, whether it's in the school curriculum itself, right? Lack of materials or educational programs that include, differing perspectives or identities, or really can be even more direct in discrimination, harassment, or oppression that may come from peers, teachers, or parents. So more school acceptance equals a better environment, such as having LGBTQ tailored services or spaces where youth can connect with each other and find peers who are supportive, such as groups like the Gay Straight Alliance. So LGBTQ people experience significant growth and development through youth and adolescence, and many milestones, including identity recognition, coming out, and transitioning, can occur during those teenage years. Positive family, educator, and peer responses can set the framework for healthy development. So when it comes to identity disclosure, youths are socialized through the lens of heteronormativity and cisnormativity, or the assumption that all youth are heterosexual. For instance, no one's expected to come out as heterosexual. It's just taken for granted, right? So identity disclosure is different for Lgbq and transgender and gender nonconforming youth. So when looking specifically at Lgbq demographics, youths and teens are acknowledging and disclosing at earlier ages their identities than ever before. By 10 years old, youth know who they're attracted to, and some know their identity as young as 7. Increased visibility in the culture may account for the fact that more people or younger people are disclosing at younger ages. Research has found that more than half of LGB youth were out to their families, and other research demonstrated that fear of family rejection or discrimination was the largest barrier to coming out for youth. When looking specifically at transgender and non-binary identity disclosures, research estimates about 0.7% of youth is transgender. And according to a 2018 HRC report, 21% of transgender and gender-expansive youth have come out to at least one of their parents. Research has also found that fathers are more likely than mothers to react negatively to a youth's disclosure of their identity. So youth begin to understand gender identity as early as 1 to 2 years old. They begin to associate body parts with gender. And by 3 years old, they can label their own gender or basically learn the gender binary, right? That they have a gender and that there's an inverse opposite one created by society. So by 5 to 6 years old, youth adopt rules about what it means to be a gender, and they start connecting the socialized gender characteristics to their own identities and their own behaviors. So gender nonconforming youth may decide to make changes to their dress or social appearance, or maybe change pronouns, which is part of that growing up adolescent process. Allowing youth to socially transition and reduce their distress and dysphoria can lessen the likelihood that transgender youth will develop depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidal ideation or suicidal attempts, self-harm, isolation, homelessness, and even incarceration. So family support is incredibly important, as we've discussed. Positive health outcomes and protective factors against negative health outcomes, happen in teen years if they have family support. So family support has a lifelong impact on our adult development, quality of life, and really can cause a reduction of overall victimization for LGBTQ youth if they have that family support in their lives. While family rejection is associated with higher levels of emotional distress, which can include suicidal ideation or suicide attempts, youths who are frequently rejected by family are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide than youth that have accepting parents. Rejection also leads to increased homelessness, particularly for youth of color. Some parents will kick out their kids when they disclose their identities, and research suggests that somewhere between 20 and 40% of all homeless teenagers are LGBT identified. So PFLAG, again, is an organization that aims to help provide bridges between families and LGBTQ youth so parents can learn how to be supportive, how to unpack their own heteronormativity or other biases, so they can build new, better relationships with their, family, with their child or whatever loved one. All right, looking at LGBTQ plus education, again, schools play a very important role in the development of youth's social skills. Obviously, that's where you're getting your educational growth and cognitive development. So this means that how accepting a school is matters a lot, not just in the time period that a youth is in school, but for the trajectory of their lives. So I'm briefly looking at some of the history of LGBTQ plus inclusivity in education. The chapter briefly touches upon a couple organizations, the first being Project 10, that started in 1984 as the first support group for LGBTQ students. It was started in a Los Angeles high school by Dr. Virginia Uribe, who experienced a ton of backlash after she started the project. But the Project 10's mission is to create a supportive, welcoming, and safe campus for sexual minority youth. So this program established the first safe zones for sexual minority youth. And there's also the group Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, GLSEN, that was founded in 1990 by a group of teachers with a passion for improving the quality of education for LGBTQ plus youth. Now, since the 90s, it's now a leading national organization. And then, of course, also in the 1990s, we got the Gay Straight Alliances, or GSAs, that was first established in Salt Lake City, Utah. As of 2015, nearly 60% of students reported having a GSA at their school. So another important, place in which, especially the curriculum needs to reflect the diversity of students, is within sex education. Historically, sex education has been about abstinence or just telling youth to abstain from having sexual contact or sexual intercourse. These classes do not teach about same-sex attraction or have discussions of LGBTQ identities, even though 85% of parents of high school students and 78% of middle school students' parents want sexual orientation to be discussed in the sex education courses that their children receive. But in reality, fewer of 4% of youth have reported any mention of sexual orientation or gender identity within their health classes, and only 12% of students were told about same-gender relationships at all. So the result of this is institutional discrimination, where heterosexuality becomes privileged and no one learns about queer identities. So it's an issue of not learning about what healthy relationships should look like. What we need is LGBTQ plus affirming sex education. And research has showed that by providing an actual affirming sex education program, this is, statistically significant results show that it can reduce unintentional teen pregnancy, reduce rates of HIV and STIs, reduce the number of sexual partners that youth will end up having, reduce the likelihood of youth engaging in unprotected sex, increase condom use and other contraceptive use, and actually delays the age at first sexual intercourse, which goes against why people think they don't want sex education for children, because they're afraid if you educate children about sex, they'll have sex. But in reality, they'll be more aware and make better choices when given more accurate and supportive information. Okay, so looking again at schools. Within neutral or negative schools, this can be problematic when schools are not inherently positive and trying to work towards creating inclusive environments. They become heteronormative. And the heteronormative socialization that goes on within these schools becomes more intense as youth age. If they go to schools that are neutral or negative, this can lead to an increased likelihood of victimization and those kind of minority health model stress issues that we talked about previously. In the chapter, they talk about the Youth Behavior Risk Surveillance Survey, which found high rates of peer bullying behaviors, finding that 10% of youth were threatened or injured with a weapon when on school property. 34% of youth reported being bullied on school property. 28% reported experiencing bullying from peers through social media. So it's like now coming home with students instead of staying at school. 23% experienced sexual dating violence in the prior year. And 18% of youth experienced physical dating violence, and another 18% were forced to have sex at some point. Gender nonconforming youth also experience frequent bullying, which has long-term effects on mental health and quality of life. And again, these mental health consequences are bad enough, but there's also negative school outcomes like having a bad grade point average, right? Because obviously you can't focus on school when you're being bullied like that. Or maybe high rates of truancy, because who wants to go to school when it's a negative place where harassment and bullying happens? So there are negative school consequences as well, and less connection with school means less likelihood of graduation, which of course affects the whole life course, not getting into college, etc., etc. Research also shows that the majority of educators have witnessed discriminatory and violent behavior towards LGBTQ plus youth in their schools. And sometimes these teachers and staff do nothing to intervene. Some of them do not report incidents for disciplinary actions or really say anything. So what does this do for the youth that are being targeted? It makes them feel alone, like nobody cares, like they matter less. What does this non-intervention do for the bullies themselves? It emboldens them. It teaches them that some people can still be oppressed without consequences. Right? They navigate the social hierarchies. They rely on prejudice to shield them from their hateful actions. And what does it tell the other students that are watching? It shows them that it's okay to harass people if they don't have as much social power. It models for them how to be bystanders and do nothing in situations when they become the adults and should be the ones intervening, but they don't know how. They haven't seen it happen. Right? So let's move into some supportive moments because this is needed, right? So some legislation has resulted in more support for LGBTQ plus inclusion in the classroom. For example, the chapter talks about how California passed legislation supporting LGBT themes within classroom materials, and that has had a positive impact. Then research has focused specifically on how this affects, children within these classrooms and the kind of social ties. There's also the Fair Education Act of 2012 that enforces inclusive and non-discriminatory curriculum. When LGBT identities are taught with value, the result is curbing bullying and suicides. And lastly, there's FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which prohibits schools from disclosing a student's transgender status. So when you have schools that actually implement the right policies, have the right trainings, have the right staff, have people that are actively engaged, then you might have supportive schools. And some schools, again, are more positive spaces for youth than others, and largely this has to do with the caring and acceptance of the educators and staff themselves. So these schools also have supportive school groups and inclusive curriculum, as well as comprehensive policies that reduce harassment and bullying. Supportive schools set the standard for all youth to be more accepting and inclusive. And there's a strong role for educators and staff, right, to be that support. Educators can make youth feel safe, they can become allies or advocates, or they can mentor students and connect them to community resources. And to be those people who will advocate for inclusion within their schools, who have the power to do so. We can't rely upon youth of a minority status to somehow just advocate for themselves. This needs to be the educators, the people that work with children. So this also includes featuring content about LGBTQ plus lives in the course content, right, which has a large impact on the mental and emotional well-being of youth. So when looking specifically at inclusive student learning, gender-inclusive curriculum teaches about the lived experiences of a wide range of LGBTQ plus people and identities. Also, incorporating materials with LGBTQ characters, for instance, in a literature class, which tends to be, a lot of the readings that we have to do are a bunch of old dead white men, that feature a very narrow perspective, very certain perspective, or you'll get the rare included, white female perspective, or you'll get one perspective from a racial or ethnic minority group once in a while. But a lot of the literature that we consider the canon, the things that has to be taught to, generation after generation, are these old white dudes. So just even including, books that have a character that's central or anything of this nature can really, make a huge impact on youth. We also need to train teachers and provide them with educational resources that are more diverse to better represent the diversity of the children that are in their classrooms. So in recent years, there's been a push for more critically responsive teaching in K through 12 education, which seeks to explore narratives beyond those historically focused on in textbooks. The problem is, some people have politicized the idea of teaching kids about the realities of the world around them, and the real histories that take into account social inequalities, that actually speak on colonization and its impact on modern-day social inequalities. It is somehow controversial to some politicians to teach kids that same-sex couples exist, or that transgender people exist, or that racism, sexism, homophobia, or ableism was and is a problem in American society. So we have seen kind of a recent political pushback on these things, but overall within the institutions of education itself, educators are much more on board about creating, a situation that's much more reflective of progress and not this kind of regression. When looking at LGBTQ plus clubs, these are school-based organizations that are developed to enhance the school community, and the groups promote advocacy for LGBTQ rights and protections and encourage youth leadership and give youth a place to socialize and build friendships and community in a supportive environment. When it comes to bathrooms and locker rooms, there's been a lot of right-wing fear-mongering in recent years on the use of bathrooms or locker rooms for gender minority youth. And youth report that bathrooms are still the most unsafe space at their school, right? They don't want to engage with these spaces because of all of this. So gender neutral or single serve bathroom, this availability of these bathrooms has increased, right, in recent years. And by providing these kinds of gender neutral or single serve bathrooms, this increases a sense of security for youth and really limits the negative backlash that might come from their bathroom choice, right? So going into a bathroom and having people being like, why are you in here, right? That's not going to happen in a gender neutral or a single serve bathroom. So it alleviates some of the stress and problems that come through those situations. Also, physical education is another problem. With more than half of LGBTQ plus youth that reporting that they've been assaulted in physical education class due to their sexual orientation or gender expression. Contrary to the media or right-wing tropes, there's no danger when people can use the bathroom of their gender identity that they choose, or when gender-neutral or single-use bathrooms are available. This harms nobody, right? But what does harm people is when people are forced to use a bathroom that does not correspond to their gender identity. Transgender people are forced to use a bathroom based on sex assignment at birth. They then become at risk for harassment, for trauma, for violence, even rape. So this is a huge issue, like nationally, but also an issue that really needs to be addressed by, the schools themselves, is that many students feel discomfort in the locker rooms or bathrooms. And so, the challenge can really be that the schools themselves are just not set up in a way that's supportive, and the educators themselves may feel unprepared or not trained, but they need to be willing to support youth. And by supporting youth, I mean all youth that they educate, not just those that are the most privileged. So by understanding the problems inherent within these systems, we can provide solutions and we can find ways to promote and provide more equitable educational experiences for LGBTQ plus youth.